Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to introduce, I'll also tell a few words about Stephen Lukes, professor, and a hero of mine. I remember as a student, I was really converted from epistemology into political and social philosophy after reading his book, Power, what was it, critical view or radical view? Yes, for a student it was very important to have that radical view. But also there was many, well, at least in our part of the world, there were debates after your another book, Liberals and Cannibals, which you published in 2003, if I remember correctly. And it was also very interesting. But today we shall discuss a very interesting topic, progress and the left idea, the left movements. Well, half of my life was spent in a country that, worshipped progress, and it was a left country. And the second half of my life was dedicated to society that does not believe in progress and where left idea is very weak. Today, for example, we don't have left parties in the parliament. So I'm really interested to hear what you can say about this, and I'm sure we will have many questions to you afterwards. Thank you.
Well, I hope so. Thank you so much. Now I've got to manage to hold this while I speak. Okay. So it's lovely to be here. I'm really glad I was invited to talk. And now I am going to talk about progress, and I'm going to talk about the left. The title I actually gave you was, and it's what I'm going to talk about, is the idea of progress and the future of social democracy. And so let me, in order to explain what I'm going to do immediately at the beginning, I'm going to start with a quotation. And the quotation kind of sums up the theme, and it comes from the late Tony Judt. And it's from his book, Ill Fares the Land, a book I like, partly because it expresses my politics and also expresses a kind of nostalgia for a British welfare state in which Tony Judt and I both grew up. We were more or less the same age. And but I'm not going to be nostalgic tonight, at least I hope not. Or maybe I am. But anyway, here is the quotation. And it's very short, but it basically sums up what I'm going to talk about. Tony Judt wrote, "It was the distinctive achievement of the Enlightenment to weld, that's to combine, classical moral categories to a secularized version of human improvement. In a well-ordered society, men would not just live well, but strive to live better than in the past. The idea of progress entered the ethical lexicon and dominated it for much of the ensuing 2 centuries. But with the exception of the hard sciences," he now asks a question, "is progress still a credible account of the world we inhabit?" That's the quotation. I'm going to read that quotation again in a moment, but that sums up what I want to talk about. The link between progress, the very idea of progress, and its history, and the question whether we could still believe in it, and in what way. So that's a big question. Now, so what I'm going to say is really divided into 4 parts. And the 4 parts are these. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit in the register of what Michal calls the philosophy of history. So I'm going to start off with the idea of progress. What is that? And I'm going to try to say that the idea of progress is actually a historical product. Human beings didn't always believe in progress. They began to believe in it at a certain moment in history. And so the question is, since it had a beginning, will it have an end? That's to say, will we stop believing in progress at some point? And what will that end look like? Will it be the end of the idea of progress, or will it even be the idea of the end of progress? So that's the first question. Let's look at what the idea of progress was. Secondly, I'm going to talk about, and Michael hinted at this already, I'm going to talk about the left. What's that? What is the concept of the left? What do we mean by the left? And I'm going to talk about this because it seems to me the left, historically, has been the segment of politics, the sector of politics, the left, that has embodied or expressed the idea of progress. The idea of progress has been, I think, most importantly, carried by the left in politics. But we need to have some idea of what that is. What was the left? And thirdly, the third part of what I want to say is going to be about social democracy, and in particular European social democracy, as being, and this is what I believe, the social democracy as the most successful embodiment of that idea, of the left idea of progress, the most successful realization of the idea of progress that we've seen. And then I'm going to end with the question which Tony Judd raised, namely, can we any longer believe in progress? And in particular, can we believe in that form of it that social democracy embodied, namely the European social democratic idea? So let me once more just repeat that quotation from Tony Judd. Down. I think that's a very good idea. I don't like holding it up. It's much better. Can you hear me all right now?
Yes.
Good. Excellent. So here's the thing. Here's Tony Judd's sentences again. It was the distinctive achievement, Tony Judd wrote, the distinctive achievement of the Enlightenment to weld classical moral categories to a secularized vision of human improvement in a well-ordered society. Men would not just live well, but strive to live better than in the past. The idea of progress entered the ethical lexicon and dominated it. The idea of progress entered the ethical lexicon and dominated it for much of the ensuing 2 centuries. But with the exception of the hard sciences, here's the question: is progress still a credible account of the world that we inhabit? And he wrote that maybe 6 or 7 years ago. It was the last book he wrote before he died. So let's start then with the first thing I want to talk about, namely the idea of progress, and the thought that I already stated, that it happened, it began. It was something that didn't exist at a certain point, and then it did exist. Well, first of all, just a word or two about what it is. I mean, I'm going to say a bit more about that in a second, but the idea of progress is like a few other ideas which are very familiar to us. I mean, there's the idea of providence, the idea that there's a divinely ordained progression across time that is, as it were, ordained from above in some divine form and realized on earth. So progress is definitely more secular. The idea of progress is more secular than providence. Then there's another similar idea is evolution. Well, progress is more voluntaristic than evolution. That's to say, evolution is something that happens anyway, independent of human will. Progress involves human volition. It involves action. It involves human beings, as it were, taking part in the process. And another word that progress is like, the idea is like, is the idea of development. But progress is more far-reaching, isn't it, than development. So progress has a distinctive set of connotations. Now, as I said before, it had a beginning. And we're going to ask in the end whether it has an end. What was its beginning? Well, I like finding beginnings to things. So I think we could say It's very arbitrary, this, but we could say the idea of progress actually was first clearly formulated by that French Enlightenment administrator and thinker Turgot, who wrote this quotation: "Manners," said Turgot, "manners are gradually softened. The human mind is enlightened. Separate nations draw nearer to each other. Commerce and policy connect at last every part of the globe, and the total mass of the human race, by alternating between calm and agitation, good and bad, marches always, however slowly, towards greater perfection." Imagine living in a world in which you could write that, think that. Well, that was Turgot in the mid-18th century. And the idea, I would just, for the sake of argument, say began then. But it was then taken up in the most, let's say, eloquent form and influential form by Condorcet, the last of the great Enlightenment philosophers. And for Condorcet, and this is interesting to think about, his book, which is called A Sketch for the Progress of the Human Mind, it was a sketch that for a book that he was going to write, but he died before he could. And the interesting thing is that in the French it says les progrès, the progresses. That's never translated into English. I don't know how it is in Ukrainian. So for Condorcet, there were several forms of progress. It wasn't just one thing. It wasn't just thinking. It was various things. And they all were assumed to progress together. And this is important from what I'm going to say. For Condorcet, there were really two stories with respect to progress. On the one hand, there was scientific progress. So that was a story that began with the earliest tribal peoples, and it's the story of applied knowledge, of technology, of knowing how, the practical and mechanical arts developing and perfecting the means of satisfying needs, from making weapons and cooking to navigation, agriculture and medicine, and so on, and making human life ever more tolerable through technical change. But then there was a second story, and that was to do with insatiable human curiosity and imagination. And this began with the Greeks, he thought, and was a still continuing story of speculative knowledge. And so these two stories intersected, he thought, because this scientific progress, once it took off, began to drive technological change forwards, and then eventually you got to ever greater knowledge. Now, Condorcet thought, and this is interesting when we think about the internet, he thought the most important thing was the invention of printing, which ended the monopoly of esoteric knowledge, and it meant the spread of scientific truths across the world so that it would become accessible to all. And so with the growth of technology and the development of scientific knowledge available to all, he thought in the end we would be, everything that was worth knowing would become understandable by ordinary people, and the result would be that across the globe we'd arrive at the perfection of laws and public institutions and the reconciliation and the identification of the interests of everyone with everyone else. That was his hope. So there were several forms of progress. There was moral progress, there was technical progress, there was economic progress, and his vision was global. I mean, he thought, in other words, this was going to unite the world, and it advanced to ever greater perfection. And indeed, I would say, and this bears on the argument I'm going to make, in a sense you could say that Condorcet was the first social democrat, because he thought what was going to happen was the elimination of inequalities. They'd be progressively diminished. Social, natural and necessary inequalities might remain, but inequalities of wealth, status, and education would all go. And he had, in a way, a very forward-looking idea. He thought, apart from the abolition of... He was a feminist. He was against slavery. And apart from the abolition of slavery, as I say, he advocated equal rights for women, civil marriage and divorce, special homes and hospitals for unmarried mothers, birth control, free secular education, and so on. And his vision was also global, though it's true that he never doubted that the sweet blessings of civilization were European. And his idea of that everyone would speak the same language, I don't think he ever doubted that it would be French. However, there was Condorcet. Now, I think those ideas, that very, as it were, thick and universalistic conception of progress, that survived. And it dominated, and I think Tony Judd is right when he said this was, in a way, dominated politics for the next 2 centuries. What happened was that, I think, in a sense, that conception of progress dominated political life across the political spectrum. So that even right-wing thinkers or right-wing movements on the left and on the right across the spectrum was somehow committed to the idea that there was this growth across time of technology, of science, of scientific knowledge, but also this involved political progress, ever more just constitutions, even moral progress. The world was becoming more civilized, and that, of course, connects up with the history of imperialism and so on. But and also the idea of even aesthetic progress. Art too was progressing. It was all bound up together, and of course there were exceptions to this, and we can immediately think of them. Georges Sorel wrote a famous book called the Illusions of Progress. And then, of course, there was Nietzsche, who, and I'm trying to find the quotation, yes, Nietzsche said, the idea of progress is merely a modern idea, that is a false idea. The European today is vastly inferior to the European of the Renaissance. Well, Nietzsche thought that. But for the most part, everybody believed in progress in one or another way. And so that's basically the end of the first part of what I want to say, that's in a very sketchy and as it were telegraphic form what I've got to say about the history of the idea of progress and what it was. Now, I claim that although progress was, as it were, a common theme across politics with some few thinkers who were clearly outside the mainstream, it was nevertheless the left which, as it were, was the explicit and most powerful and important way in which this idea was promoted and developed and advanced. And in particular, there was this idea that economic growth and technological growth, which were assumed to go hand in hand, would lead across time to the diminishment of inequalities between classes and races, indeed, even. And so what you have is a history of the left as the carrier of progress. This is what I would claim. And so what is this? This is what I think postmodernists call a meta-narrative. It's a story about the whole of history that, in a way, is meant to encompass the whole of the human race, both past, present, and future. And that seems to me one very central aspect of what is distinctive of the left. So now I want to say something about what the left means, and what that word, the left, what that concept denotes. I mean, I think we can argue about this endlessly, and perhaps we will. But I think, like with the idea of progress, I'd like to point out that this concept, this phenomenon, the left, has a history too, and I'd also, just for the sake of discussion, like to say that it has a beginning, and then of course we can discuss whether it has an end. The beginning was actually, and this is historically, I think, established. The left began at a certain moment, actually in 1789, in the States General in France, at the time of the French Revolution, when a particular part of the Estates General who were debating the question of the suspension of the veto of the king were called the left part. And so left and right was actually a distinction that was invented then, though it didn't actually become current until the mid-19th century, when it started to be used as a way of dividing politicians' positions from one another in the various parliamentary assemblies of Europe. And it then has, as it were, survived until the present, though you, of course, often hearing people who are saying that the left-right distinction doesn't mean anything anymore. Well, what did it mean? I think it meant what it captures is the idea that there's something wrong with the order of society. Actually, it's interesting just to think for a moment. I don't know how it is in Ukrainian, but if you just think about language, left and right, that binary, that opposition exists in lots of languages. And it's always the case, as far as I know, or perhaps almost always the case, that the left is not so good. Sinister is gauche in French, whereas right, droit, diritto in Italian. How is it in Ukrainian, incidentally? Is it the same thing? Yes. The left is always signifying something that is not the way it should be. And the right is always indicates what's proper, correct, straight, upright, as opposed to somehow bent and inferior. And that actually suggests to me an interesting way of thinking about what the project of the left had always been. And so what I'd like to suggest is you could think about the left as the project of rectification. In other words, putting things right. In other words, reordering society in such a way that what is inferior is no longer inferior. So the left is the project of greater, it seems to me, the idea of rectifying the social order such that, in such a way that you achieve a greater equality. That is right there at the heart of the left. And not only that, it's also the idea that this is an expandable project. This is a project which can begin with very straightforward things like income or wealth, but can then expand to issues of racial subordination, gender, eventually questions of sexual orientation. In other words, that the question of what it is that is inferior, and what way people can be inferior to others, is an expandable topic, an expandable issue, set of issues. And so, and not only that, of course, the project of the left is also implicitly universalistic, in the sense that it's not just a question of reordering the relations between people within a particular community or particular society or particular nation, but can expand across the world. So we get back to Condorcet's idea that it's kind of global in scope. So it seems to me those are features of the left. You could say, just to sum up what I've just been saying, it's a kind of project of rectification that is universalistic in scope, and it's about putting society to rights by reordering, by finding, by achieving social political change that is universal in scope, both in the sense of the range of dimensions in which people's inequalities are manifested, and in respect of the geographical limits, the geographical scope of it, so that it becomes global in scope. Now, I realize I'm being very assertive here, but this is just for the sake of discussion. Now, what I think we can say historically is that there have been two major historically significant ways in which the left project has been pursued since the 18th century, and we're really here talking about the last 2 centuries, the previous 2 centuries, the 2 centuries that followed, namely the 19th and the 20th. The 2 projects being, on the one hand, the non-liberal version, and on the other hand, the liberal version. The non-liberal version was the Marxist one, the socialist one, where this was indeed the idea that, in other words, across history, there was to be a project, or rather that the process of rectification occurred across history, of course, in contradictory ways, I mean ways that involved revolutionary change at various points, and here too, going back to Condorcet, you see a linkage between the technological, the scientific, the economic, the political, and the realm of ideology. It's all bound up together. So as the forces of production develop across time and come at various points in history into conflict with the relations of production, you get a story of progressive historical transformation that leads ultimately to the class war and the revolutionary change that will abolish all classes, and what used to be called in Soviet times, I believe, the radiant future. The world, in other words, in which finally the inequality, the class domination will be overcome, and you will achieve a future where finally the disordered world of the past has become ordered into the free association of individuals. And basically, of course, the idea behind all of this is, which was Marx's idea, a liberation from the fetters of class domination. Finally, there'll be free time to people to live fulfilled lives. Now, that's hardly unfamiliar to people in this room. I'm sure you all know about this from your own history, or the history of your parents. But there is also another quite different, or not totally different, but significantly different story, which is, I would like to say, the liberal version, or if you like, the social democratic version. That is to say, also another meta-narrative, I mean, a story which tells, which covers the whole of human history, but which, or at least in this particular case, more importantly, the more modern period, but reaches also into the future, in which a similar story is, or a parallel story is told about the reordering of society, the project of rectification. So now I want to come to the third part of what I want to say, which is social democracy. And actually, it's really European social democracy that's at issue. You can tell this story in various ways, and I'm just going to suggest 2. It's also a story about the development of the left, but it's a different story than the Marxist one. One way of telling this story is as a story of the progressive development of rights. There was a British sociologist called T.H. Marshall who tells this story, I think, in a very compelling way, which is basically that rights existed really from, in modern times, let's say, go back to the 18th century, first of all, in the form of political rights. Political rights, civic rights, citizens' rights, the rights of the citizen, as formulated, for example, French Revolution. And these become the rights of citizens to vote, for instance, free association, rights of free expression. And then they get expanded. And so from those rights to a vote and to expressing your role as a citizen, you can then claim economic rights, rights to property, rights to right to work eventually. And then these rights expand to social rights to, for example, to acquiring the basis for a decent life. And there's a story of expanding rights. That's the story that Marshall tells. So T.H. Marshall's picture of this is that you can think of the development of social democracy, what eventually becomes social democracy, as a sort of expansion from the earliest liberal period, where really it's just a question of, it's merely a question of individuals expressing their rights as citizens, to an expanded notion of what citizenship means. So that eventually the idea of, for example, having a right to, let's say, holidays with pay, as said. I mean, if you just think about the Declaration of Human Rights in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Rights, the rights get expanded so that eventually people have a right to social goods, to the for instance, to the conditions for citizenship that would involve, for instance, right to education, equal rights to public libraries, for instance, public parks, the kinds of conditions for living a life which becomes increasingly more widely considered in terms of what would constitute a decent life. Now, this is one way to tell the story, the idea of expanding rights in which they become increasingly social in character. And that's one way to tell the story. Another way would be more historical. So if you just think about the 20th century particularly, you have, where social democracy really comes into its own, you have in the 1920s, you have Keynes, you have in the 1930s, you have in the United States the New Deal. In Scandinavia, you have the development of corporate kind of cooperation between trade unions and the state, in which capitalism's tendencies to crisis, which were diagnosed, of course, within the Marxist tradition, become increasingly under control. So that capitalism becomes a subject to political organization and political control. And the techniques involve, of course, fiscal management and monetary management, but also redistribution becomes a central question, taxation policy. In other words, capitalism starts to get regulated, and the process of making it more, as it were, thinking about ways in which a capitalist society can become more just becomes central. And of course, in the earliest versions, which you get, for example, in Britain in the early part of the 20th century with liberalism, this eventually gets, the embodiment of this is, in Europe, is in the form of labor parties, socialist parties, which are not Marxist, which distinguish themselves from Marxism, and in particular, of course, in Scandinavia, where it gets it gets embodied in the form of Scandinavian social democracy in the post-war period. Now, what then happens is that war plays an enormously important part in this story, because with the necessity to develop war economies, the state, of course, necessarily has to take a much more central role. And women are enlisted, as they had been, of course, in the First World War, into the labor force. Trade unions grow, of course, and have grown considerably in strength. And so this combination of the increasing role of unions and the increasing role of the state, greatly enhanced because of war, you then get, with the 1945 and the development of and the what you might call the post-war settlement in Europe, a huge and very important move towards redistribution and regulation of European economies. And in Britain you get the British National Health Service. In France you get planning, and in Scandinavia you get the development of Scandinavian social democracy. So that's another way of telling the story about the development of what I previously called the left interpretation, or a left interpretation of the politics of the politics of progress. I'm not saying anything right now, because you all know it, about what happened east of in the eastern part. That was a different story altogether, in which the left project has taken a quite different form. And we can talk about that, but I'm not talking about it here because my focus is on social democracy. So what happened? Well, I would say that what we get is various versions of this social democratic project realized in Europe, in Britain, in France, in Germany in a different way, in Italy, in different European countries. And you get a particularly, I think, effective form of it in Scandinavia, where you have, I think, a version of this social democracy which I would say, and here I just express my judgment and we can discuss it, the most successful form. I think that if we're thinking about the different versions of social democracy, on the one hand we could do what Tony Judd did, and what I'm certainly inclined to do, is to look back on the Britain of the 1970s as, or even earlier maybe, as with nostalgia, as a time when the socialist project, in this sense, the social democratic project, had achieved considerable success. But even more successful was the Scandinavian version, with childcare for all, basically where poverty in the society was largely, almost entirely overcome, a high level of equality of condition, public provision of all kinds. I don't want to seem to romanticize this, but it was a time when, the whole period, in other words, since the Second World War, from 1945 onwards, of 30 years, really, until the 1970s, has sometimes been called les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, when social democracy was at its height and most successful. And I'd here like to quote the German British sociologist working in Britain, Ralph Dahrendorf, wrote an article in 1979 which was called The End of the Social Democratic Consensus ? And he wrote, and the date is interesting, 79, he said, in many respects, the social democratic consensus, he meant the consensus about the success of social democracy, which had prevailed really for the previous 30 years, signifies the greatest progress which history has seen so far, he wrote. Never before have so many people had so many life chances. And I think that actually, at that time, was a judgment that was pretty accurate. And looking back, I would say probably that the social democracy of that time, and in particular, actually, in its Scandinavian form, is probably the best I think Condorcet would have probably thought, we're really getting there, actually. However, as I said, Dahrendorf's article, 79, remember, 1981, 2 years later, Mitterrand comes into power, and basically he then says, this isn't really working very well, and it becomes, he has to abandon quite a number of the commitments that have been made. But anyway, 79, Ralph Dahrendorf writes that, and then, however, he says, remember, there's a question mark. Is this at an end? He's already asking. And he thinks that maybe it is, and he sees 4 problems. And the 4 problems are these. First, he says, from a certain point onwards, the happy spiral, of technical progress, replacement of human nature, of human labor, the spiral of technical progress, replacement of human labor, creation of new possibilities for work. In other words, the idea that there's going to be more and more work for people, this is no longer happening. Society runs out of work, he thinks. The consensus parties have only one prescription, namely more economic growth. So he's worried that this combination of economic growth, technical development, and more work for people, that's not happening, he begins to see, very perceptibly. Secondly, he says that he's worried about what came to be called the fiscal crisis. He says that higher taxes needed to finance even ever more social policies were putting people on the impersonal leash of giant bureaucracies. In other words, people are beginning to revolt against higher taxes, and they're worried about their freedom, their economic freedom, by the demands of taxation. Thirdly, he thought that equal educational opportunities had a built-in frustration effect. As more and more people qualified, their success meant less. So he's worried about the fact that people are becoming more and more qualified, but that the qualified people aren't finding jobs that meet their expectations. That as people get more qualified educationally, they're getting more and more frustrated. And fourthly, he thinks that he thought that in 79, that with increased social mobility, people lose their social identities, losing their sense of allegiance to family, occupation, and place of residence. He's worried about the sense of community that may be being lost. Now, these are all perceptive things he was perceiving, was realizing. But I have to say that I think these now, today, look like rather small worries. So I'm going to now turn to the fourth part of what I have to say, which is really to talk about in other words, to address Tony Judd's fourth question, namely, can we any longer believe in progress? But notice that, what I'm now I'm asking this question in the light of what I've just been saying, in the form of, can we any longer believe in European social democracy? The left project, as realized in the social democratic form, is that still a realizable ideal? Why am I focusing particularly in this way on European social democracy? Well, it's partly because I actually agree with Dahrendorf that was probably the best that has been achieved. Looking back, I think it looks even more like that. But also because, since I'm addressing you and we're talking in Ukraine, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Maidan idea of Europe was partly this, wasn't it? When you think about Europe, you were, of course, thinking about liberties, rule of law. You were thinking about liberal democracy, but it seems to me you were also thinking, were you not, about social democracy? And that's been a story all the way through. Even if you think further back in time to say Gorbachev, with his reforms in the Soviet Union. I believe it to be true that Gorbachev also, when envisaging, well, what was his ideal? It was something like Scandinavia, that he wanted to convert he wanted to reform the Soviet Union into. He failed, of course, but that was, I think, his idea. And so the question is, can we now think in terms of social democracy as a realizable goal? And as I say, I think that the Dahrendorf worries, which I've just been run through, were serious ones. You know, were we going to run out of work? Were the educational increasing of social mobility, was increasing higher education a problem? All these things, they pale, I think, in significance in comparison with what we are thinking about today. And so let me now list those things. Now, I said that this idea of progress as embodied in the socialist, or rather the social democratic project of the left, involves, and here we go back to Condorcet, this idea of a story, a meta-narrative that embraces history, which involves a story about how we've got to where we are, the past, history, and also a projection into the future, in which there is this idea of tying together, that things are there's a kind of coherence to this story, in which the technological progress, scientific progress, economic progress, political progress, even moral progress, increasingly civilized life, all of this is tied up together. I mean, I remember from the discussions that used to exist in the Labour Party in Britain in the 1960s, for instance, there was this idea that economic growth was a kind of solvent. It was a kind of provided you had greater economic growth, just continuing, and it was for a long time thought, certainly then, that this was an inevitable process. We would just grow and grow. There was never going to be any end to it. All the basic social problems would be eventually solved because of the increasing economic growth. And I remember there was a British socialist called, Labour minister called Anthony Crosland, who wrote a book called The Future of Socialism, which was a very social democratic sort of title of a book. And in that book, he basically just thought socialism was going to come about, whatever as it were, its opponents said, conservatives of various kinds, socialism would come about. And by socialism, he meant social democracy. It wasn't any kind of Marxist idea. Now, so just as the Marxists had Marxism and communism have a kind of an inevitability idea, the Social Democrats had this idea too, that there was, and it was also in a way technologically and economically driven. So what are the problems? Well, first, it's that very idea of growth I think we have to think about, whether actually the prospect of unlimited growth, in the first place, is even a plausible idea. Is the economic growth that we experienced, and certainly experienced in a very vivid way in the 30 years that followed the Second World War, the 30 glorious years, is that going to go on? And here I'm going to cite, in case you don't know of it, or even if you do, a really fascinating analysis. I haven't come here to tell a happy story, actually, so forgive me if this all sounds a bit how shall I say, cold water being thrown on ideas that we want to believe in. So Robert Gordon, in an article on this topic, suggests the following thought, that maybe the rapid growth that we experienced in a very vivid way after the Second World War, but actually, to tell the truth, for the last 250 years, may be just a blip, a historical episode that's going to come to an end. Before 1750, there was no growth at all in human history really to speak of. Economic growth was not significant. From 1750 to 1830, there was a significant major spurt. You could call it the first industrial revolution, involving steam and railroads mainly. Then, and this is really important, from 1870 to 1900, there was a fantastic growth of economic growth that was technologically generated. If you just recall, I mean, electricity, the internal combustion engine, running water, indoor toilets, communications of all kinds, petroleum, and so on. All these things happened at that time, and there was an enormous spurt of growth. And then, and there were lots of byproducts to that, which were involved, for example, air travel, intersecting motorways. All these things happened in that time. And then there is, of course, the third industrial revolution, which we're living through, which began in 1960 with computers, the web, mobile phones, and all the rest of it, information technology. Now, Gordon's argument is that it's basically that second one, the revolution that occurred between 1870 and 1900, that's been so important, and has led to 80 years since then of rapid economic growth between 1890 and the 1970s, with massive spin-offs of inventions of all kinds. And the gloomy thought that he makes, now this is of course just futurology, speculating about the future, but he does suggest that actually the enormous productivity growth, the generation of work that was generated in that period, is not visible in, if you think about the internet and the mobile phones and the whole information technology. It doesn't generate work in the same way, and it doesn't generate productivity in the same way. Now, you could, of course, say, well, that's a story about the West, or in the United States, Europe, and maybe it'll be a different story. It is a different story, obviously, in China and India. But nevertheless, the idea is that, because a lot of these spin-offs that have occurred as a result of that economic growth, for example, air travel, speed, there's a limit to how fast you can travel. Urbanization, all these are one-off spin-offs that once you've achieved a certain level, then the technology doesn't take you any further. Now, it could, of course, be, it may well be, how can we predict, how can we know that the technological developments of the future will generate productivity growth of a similar sort? But we don't, at the moment, there's no basis for saying that. How am I doing for time, by the way? Yeah. We're going to come to an end.
Yes.
Almost at an end. Right. Well, here's the end. I'm just going to list these thoughts. That maybe that's a blip. Maybe, in other words, economic growth is not any longer going to happen in the same way. Another kind of blip, and another kind of thought of a similar sort is what Thomas Piketty has suggested, namely that the other thing that's supposed to happen with the project of rectification is the diminishment of inequality. And of course, for a long time, people thought that was going to happen across time. You know, there was just going to be this, Simon Kuznets, the economist, predicted that across time, human history, eventually inequality was going to diminish. Well, maybe that did happen in the 20th century, but maybe now what are we seeing? We're seeing everywhere, and certainly in advanced industrial societies, the exponential growth, the 1% versus the 99%, the growth of inequality. So I'm running out of time, so let me just say two or three other things. Well, we have, and here's a big question, and I'm just going to mention it, and we talked about it, of course, a lot yesterday, immigration. Social democracy maybe requires a certain kind of social homogeneity. As societies become increasingly diverse, can social democracy survive the increased perception of difference within societies? Does the success of, say, Denmark or Sweden, did it depend upon cultural homogeneity? It's a question. Climate change, that's another huge issue which didn't even cross Dahrendorf's mind. And then European social democracy is what we've been talking about. But is European social democracy sustainable, where the European phenomenon seems to involve an increasing division between winners and losers? So I'm going to stop there. Those are a set of, as it were, not terribly cheerful thoughts that just add to Dahrendorf's list.
Well, thank you very much for your lecture. And definitely we have some questions here, but as a moderator, I will use and abuse my position, and I will ask the first question, and it's actually, I would like you to comment. So I'm struggling with the paradox. So as empiricist, I know there are evidences in my experience that the concept of humanity is probably quite realistic. Probably it describes many similarities that I witness as a living creature. But there's also a lack of evidence for me that there is a progress. So I see that in science definitely there is. In humanities, well, it's a question mark. In medicine, yes, there is, but in other areas of knowledge or practices or human lives, there's just a complication or sometimes even reverse development, regress. But at the same time, as a realist and empiricist, I witness as soon as we start questioning that there is such a thing as progress, we immediately end up with a worse society, with a worse politics, and with a worse economy. So there's a paradox. There is no evidence to say that there is a progress.
We've got to go and believe in it.
Yes, we must believe in it.
Well, yes. Now, I think that's true. I think that to believe in progress is a very, it sustains you, it keeps you going. You even, I'd put it even stronger. I think it's not only that you believe in progress, maybe you have to even believe in the inevitability of it. Mm-hmm. So that if you just think about it for a moment, I didn't talk about it at all, but if you think about communism and Lenin believed things were inevitable, that the world was going to get better. The radiant future was inevitable, he thought. And that encouraged him. That was a kind of, it's as though he believed something was going to happen, and the fact that he believed it was going to happen, it strengthened his will. It was going to happen anyway, even despite his will, but that was encouraging him. So you're right, but then I think that on the other side, it is a paradox, because we really want to know what the truth is. And so that means we've got to look at what all the perils, or what all the dangers are, and all the reasons for being skeptical. So anyway.
Okay. Questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much, thanks lecturer. And I want to ask you about one very question in our society. When we say about progress, we say about the progress in Western country, in global North, absolutely excluding post-colonial space, especially Middle East, Asia, tropical Africa, and other post-colonial areas. And maybe in now there are two basic theories which fight between each other. There are theory of modernization and theory of dependent development. And in Ukraine discourse, as I have noticed, the theory of modernization dominates. And it's very strange, for example, for me, because we are the part of post-Soviet space, which is also a very post-colonial syndrome. Really, European and North American countries had very good progress in different areas during last century, but when we see to the Middle East, to the Asia or tropical Africa, we see absolutely another situation. What can you say about the specifics of the progress in post-colonial areas, and how can you prognose the situation of the development of these countries and space? Thank you very much.
I don't know. I mean, I think by modernization you mean that old theory that somehow the world was converging towards a kind of modern condition. I think it's hard any longer to believe in that. I mean, I think that was something, and in particular the idea which existed in the 1960s that the Soviet world and the Western world were kind of converging towards a kind of modern, and that the whole world was eventually. I mean, we can't believe that anymore. I don't think, can we? But dependent development, that's an idea which, yes, the post-colonial situation. I think that, in fact, what you've done is just added to my list, actually, of the problems that people face, and particular societies like this. If you're asking me for a solution, I'm afraid that really means another lecture. I'd love to.
No, that's a hope. Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you. I actually have two questions. One about social democracy, another about progress. For social democracy, you might know that here in Ukraine, because of the bad Soviet Union experience, we presently have this huge issue of decommunization, vanishing everything related to decommunization. Yeah, vanishing everything that is related to communism. And socialism also has this bad label because it was Socialistic Republic Union. And people sometimes, they generalize too much. They don't have a clear idea what is good, what is bad in socialism, in social democracy. I know that general education can have a deal with that, but I can't personally influence on general education, but what I can do, I can advise to Ukrainian publishers a good book to translate. So what can it be? A book or several? And another question related to progress.
So was that question?
Yeah, actually, yeah, that's simply what book on social democracy you can advise that it might not have been published in Ukraine yet. What can easily explain to masses of people, to young people, for Ukrainian audience, maybe.
The socialism you're afraid of is not the socialism you know.
Exactly. Yeah, and another. Sure. No, yeah, and another one is for progress. You've talked about economical and technical also, and you didn't mention that technical progress is also something that was really dangerous during the 20th century, the atomic bomb issues, weapons in general, and still we have, there is none that is overcame. We have Northern Korea, we have Russia yet, we have countries who have nuclear weapon, and so how this ethic, moral progress that you've talked about, what should we people, like simple people, do for this moral and ethic progress to rise, like, I don't know, to be faster than technical progress that can eventually kill the humanity in the moment? Yeah.
That is so interesting, that second point. I mean, about the first, I have to think about one book. I don't know, but I can think of a few books. But on the second point, that's something I didn't give myself time to say anything about, namely the dangers of progress, the dark side of technical progress. I mean, the most obvious thing being the increase, ever since 1945, the capacity of humanity to destroy itself. I mean, to destroy the world, actually. But not just that, the ways in which we see technical progress actually harming. I mean, just think about the extraction of non-renewable fuels and the whole question of like in America, fracking, for example. All the ways in which technological progress has actually impacted in very dangerous ways on the quality of human life. I mean, you're absolutely right. And that is just a huge issue. That's a further issue that we can add again to the list. Again, I think the social democratic way of thinking about that is just that has to be brought into the political sphere. I mean, there is an interesting sociologist, Klaus Offe, who thinks, that social democracy, indeed the very idea of progress, has to become conservative. In other words, it's something we have to think about, namely preserving the quality of human life against the dangers of technical progress. I think that's maybe what you're suggesting. So in some ways, I mean, that leads you actually into green politics, it seems to me. That leads you into the direction of thinking we've actually got to worry not only about the impact of technical progress upon the quality of human life, but even of economic growth upon the quality of human life. And so there is actually, of course, a movements in the West, more powerful in some countries than in others, to think about actually no growth or restricting growth or finding ways in which we've got to actually start to think of ways in which we've got to actually live with the thought that economic growth is going to be less. I mean, I don't think it's very, as it were, feasible to think about actually proposing that as a political program, namely less growth. That's not going to work. But if the first thing I said before there about the prospects of growth being perhaps diminished in the future anyway in the industrialized part of the world, we have to ask a question that's asked by Robert Skidelsky in a recent book: how much is enough? I mean, what is the rationale for just thinking we need more and more economic growth, especially in the face of the massive inequalities that exist? So those are all big questions that you raise. Now, as for books, maybe we should talk about that afterwards. I'm not sure that I can think of any one book. What? Well, of course, yes, there's Tony Judd's. But the trouble, Tony Judd's book is worth reading. And I think Tony Judd is of interest in Ukraine, I gather. People are reading him. And that's great. He's a wonderful historian. As for the book that I quoted from, Ill Fares of the Land, my problem with it is there are no, but then you can make exactly the same criticism of me, there are no solutions in it. It's really about changing the discourse. We've got to find other vocabularies. That's a good starting point, but in a sense, it's a rather despairing book, I actually think. Yeah.
Yes.
If I may address the, I don't
Yeah.
the audience for change, because we are sitting here in the premises of Kritika Polityczna, a foreign agent reported from Poland. And I would like to know how you imagine the future of the left for your country.
Oh, yeah.
We must discuss this here.
Yeah.
Do you have some answers on it?
I don't have an answer for it, but maybe I will include the answer in my question.
Please, yeah.
Or would you rather speak about it?
Maybe I missed it because I was a little bit late, but as someone who researches specifically conflict economies, I have noticed lately that, and this is also something that surprises me when you say the difference between East and West was perhaps erased, but now it's implausible. When you look at the echelons of power, military power, state power, the marriage between state and commerce, there were very few divides between people who deal with power and benefit from it. Much fewer than a common people are made to believe by ideologies installed in educations and books. So Russia trades with US and Ukraine does business with Russia still, while Russia is at war with Ukraine on a human level, on a business level. It continues. And Europe, that perfect democratic, socio-democratic system of which I'm a citizen, I'm a Dane. Denmark is involved in conflict that cost lives to thousands and thousands of civilians alongside of United States, and United States is actually bombing civilians in Syria next to Russian planes so close that what kind of ideological difference we can talk about, they can barely divide the airspace. So I was wondering, and maybe this also brings us closer to the Ukrainian problem, where the word left is very prevalent and almost no discussion, be it art or politics, begin without people identifying themselves as left. And I can see why, because left is being so pushed out that people want to, in resistance to this, push out, identify as a left artist, less politics. But I wonder, and this is maybe, I'm asking because I haven't heard this word from you before, maybe instead of dividing this into left and right, where the topology is already set and the language is predefined and we're stuck with that, maybe we can talk more about the privilege and the underprivilege and talk about how do we approach those with privilege and how do we trick them or convince them or persuade them to resign some of this privilege, because this is very interesting for me, because I don't think Israeli-Palestinian conflict or conflict in Ukraine or conflict with migration would be in any way resolved by ideology alone unless we touch down on how do we ask those with more privilege to surrender some of it.
Well, you said lots of interesting things there, but the last bit I found puzzling. How do we ask the privileged to abandon their privilege? I don't think that's going to get anywhere.
Well, how do we trick them? How do we find them?
Well, yeah, I think we have to think about the language of conflict and struggle and politics. And I think asking, I mean, maybe I'm just picking a word wrongly from you, but I think it has to be thought of in terms of a struggle. But the problem is that historically, that was always a function of organization and power in the form of, in the West, for instance, like as I tried to say, it was organized, it was political, it was to do with trade unions in the history of social democracy. What we have today is a different situation in which unions are increasingly weakened. And so, I don't know. I mean, I think that, but just going back to what you said before about convergence, you seem to think that the difference between East and West is minimal because they're in some way increasingly similar and involved you seem to say that the distinction between them is misplaced. That they
because they're partners, they trade together and they stick together when it comes
they
to
do.
defense of power.
Mm-hmm.
If we talk about secrecy, they would both align, both National Agency of Russia and say align to the same, they would adhere to the same level of secrecy.
Mm.
I argue between each other, but when three spies sit down in a room, they have a perfect agreement between each other.
Mm-hmm.
Because they protect a certain power, it's a club.
Well, there are certainly ways in which that's true, and certainly if you think about warfare and you think about, but I still would say, and I wonder if you wouldn't agree, there are enormous differences that are significant and important between the Soviet-style economy and the Western democratic ones. I mean, it seems to me, while you can certainly point to ways in which they collaborate and can.
Right now, everyone seems to trade with everyone.
Trade, yes, but I think that, for example, without wishing to repeat myself too much, I think that, for instance, if you look at even say Denmark today, for example, is a very different kind of society and economy than, let's say, I'm being extreme now, but say Kazakhstan. I mean, there are huge differences between forms of social organization, and so liberal democracy is a crucial element of a feature of social democracy. And I think that it's important to keep that in mind, even while being fully aware of huge ways in which these societies, as they operate, fall short of their ideals.
Okay, I think we are very late in the evening, and thank you very much again for your wonderful lecture and the discussion. Thank you very much.